Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1937, was Disney's first animated feature film and is considered a classic fairy tale. It follows the story of Snow White, a princess whose beauty is seen as a threat by the evil queen, her stepmother. Consumed by jealousy, the queen consults the magic mirror, which repeatedly confirms that Snow White is the fairest of them all. To eliminate her rival, the queen devises a plan to poison the princess with an apple. Snow White, upon biting the apple, falls into a deep sleep, seemingly irreversible. This is where the dark theory begins. Some fans believe that Snow White actually dies when she bites the poisoned apple, and that everything we see afterward is a representation of her spiritual journey toward the afterlife. Thus, the traditional happy ending becomes a metaphor for her acceptance of death and her path to eternal peace. When we analyze the scenes that follow the apple bite, we can observe several clues supporting this theory. First, when Snow White falls into her deep sleep, she is placed in a glass coffin by the dwarfs, symbolizing a sort of honorable burial, but still in view of everyone, as if she were at a wake. The choice of glass is also significant, as it allows her to be seen but never touched, a metaphor for the separation between the world of the living and the dead. The prince's kiss, traditionally seen as a gesture of love that awakens her, can be interpreted in a new light as a symbolic ritual of spiritual passage. In many cultures, the kiss is a symbol of farewell and transition to the beyond, not necessarily a return to life. Thus, instead of reviving Snow White, the prince would actually be helping her soul completely detach from the earthly world, completing her spiritual journey. The final scene is the most intriguing part of this theory. After the kiss, Snow White is carried by the prince on a white horse, and together they head toward a castle in the clouds. The white horse is a common figure in myths and stories as a symbol of purity, transcendence, and spiritual passage, often representing a guide to heaven or a higher spiritual destination. The castle, positioned among the clouds, reinforces this idea of ascension to paradise, suggesting that Snow White's final destination is actually eternal rest, not a return to ordinary life. The magic mirror, which is a central element in the narrative, plays an even deeper role when viewed in light of this theory. From the beginning, it is presented as an almost omniscient entity, which knows absolute truths and seems to speak from a realm beyond the physical world. When invoked by the queen, the mirror reflects a nebulous image, shrouded in smoke and mystery, which can be interpreted as a direct connection to the beyond, where spirits and hidden truths reside. There is an interesting interpretation that the mirror is not just an instrument of vanity for the queen, but a spiritual mediator. It may be actively influencing the course of events, guiding not only the queen in her destructive quest, but also Snow White on her path to spiritual liberation. While the queen sees the mirror as a tool of control, it may actually be directing the narrative in a way that creates Snow White's passage. If the mirror is a portal to the spiritual world, its hidden function in the story is much deeper. It may have been a sort of spiritual architect who, over time, was alongside both the queen and Snow White, each on their opposing journeys. The mirror might have been, from the start, a key piece in Snow White's spiritual transition process, indicating that its presence goes beyond simply confirming the queen's vanity. If we consider the theory to be true, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs reveals a much deeper and spiritual narrative than the classic happily ever after approach. In this new context, the film becomes a representation of the acceptance of death and the transition to a state of eternal peace, rather than a simple story of reborn love. Snow White is not returning to life. On the contrary, she is shedding her earthly body, guided by forces beyond human understanding, represented by the prince, the magic mirror, and even the white horse that symbolizes the passage to paradise. The prince ceases to be merely the romantic hero and becomes an almost angelic figure, someone who appears at the most critical moment of Snow White's transition to the beyond. His kiss, traditionally interpreted as a symbol of true love, here takes on the role of a final ritual, a last farewell before Snow White is taken to a place of eternal rest. This gives the act a deeper meaning. It is a gesture of release, not of a return to life. The castle among the clouds, generally seen as the character's happy destination, becomes a clear metaphor for heaven. The aesthetic choice of showing it surrounded by clouds reinforces this spiritual image of ascension, connecting to various beliefs and myths, where heaven is the final destination of pure souls. Snow White's journey culminates in this scene, symbolizing true liberation and acceptance of death as a passage to eternity. If the magic mirror is truly the mediator between worlds, it played its role subtly and effectively respectively, leading both the Queen and Snow White to their respective spiritual destinies. The Queen is consumed by her vanity and ambition, condemned by her own desires, while Snow White is purified and freed from her earthly suffering. The mirror, then, is not just a reflection of vanity, but a symbol of judgment and transition, completing a spiritual cycle. When Snow White is forced to flee into the forest after being threatened by the huntsman, the environment transforms into a dark and mysterious place, almost as if she were crossing into an unknown world. This shadowy scene, with twisted trees and frightening figures, is not just a visual representation of fear, but may symbolize something deeper: limbo, a transitional space between life and death. As she runs desperately, Snow White faces distorted images that seem to arise from her worst fears, as if the forest were reflecting the initial terror of death. This represents the beginning of her spiritual journey, where she is confronted by unknown forces, a recurring element in many stories of transition to the beyond. But when she finally crosses the forest and finds the dwarf's cabin, the atmosphere changes from a sense of threat to one of comfort. In this sense, the dwarfs become symbols of temporary rest and spiritual protection, as if the cabin were a sanctuary amid the chaos of limbo. The crossing of the forest, therefore, marks the beginning of the process of accepting her condition, suggesting that Snow White's journey goes beyond appearances. She is on a path of purification, where the initial horrors need to be faced for peace to be achieved. The prince's kiss on Snow White is traditionally seen as an act of true love that breaks the spell of death. However, this interpretation can be much more symbolic when we look at the gesture as a farewell ritual, a final goodbye before her soul moves on to the beyond. In various cultures and mythologies, the kiss is a final gesture of transition, a seal of release that allows the soul to rest in peace. The scene of the kiss also resembles funeral rituals, where loved ones say goodbye to the deceased with a final touch, symbolizing the definitive separation of the physical body and the departure to a new stage. In this context, the prince is not just the hero who rescues Snow White. He is a spiritual guide, someone who appears at the most crucial moment to facilitate the passage of her soul. The kiss, then, is not the beginning of a romance, but rather the starting point for the character's complete liberation. After the kiss, the prince carries Snow White on a white horse, which, in many traditions, represents purity, transcendence, and the final guide to heaven. They head toward the castle among the clouds, which is a clear representation of paradise. Here, the kiss becomes an act that seals Snow White's fate, allowing her to cross the celestial portal and reach her eternal rest. What seems to be a simple happy ending is, in fact, a metaphor for the acceptance of death and the transition to spiritual peace. This vision completely alters how we understand the prince's kiss, bringing a deeper layer of meaning to the classic fairy tale. And if this interpretation is correct, Snow White's happy ending is deeper than it appears. It is an acceptance of life after death, a serene transition to a state of eternal peace. This brings to light a fascinating question. What lies beyond what we see in fairy tales? Do other classics hide similar symbolism?